Well, hello friends, and welcome to another Ask Zach. Today we're going to talk about a hugely influential guitarist that is somewhat underrated, and or maybe if you know about him, you don't know the extent to which he deserves our respect, and that's Pete Anderson. So first, a little pause for the cause. If you've been enjoying the show, please subscribe. If you want to support the show, go to askzach.com. There's a store there. We've got t-shirts and mugs. I think we have got some baseball hats now and some other things, so you can check that out there. Also at askzach.com, I've been uploading a variety of older articles and kind of newer things. So one is the wiring diagram for the Telecaster so that you can bypass the neck. You can bypass the tone control on the neck. So in other words, the tone control only works on the bridge. And so I've been talking about this for a long time. And finally, I created a wiring diagram. So that's on there. Also, there are interviews with Richard Bennett that was for Vintage Guitar Magazine back in 2006. 2006 interview with Brad Paisley that I did covering the Time Well Wasted album and tour. And it has a bunch of great photos. Some by Rusty Russell and some by myself. Also, I found the recording notes for the Time Well Wasted album. And so I've listed all the different guitar parts and what guitars, amps, and pedals were used on each song, on that album. So that's all at askzach.com. So go check that out. So Pete Anderson, first off, he's from the Detroit area and grew up, playing, rock music and blues and such, and then moved out to Southern California, hooked up with Dwight Yoakam, and they were playing the bars and clubs, and Pete really kind of honed in, Dwight's thing, and ended up being his producer and collaborator, from then up until, the early 2000s when they kind of parted ways. That first album, Guitars, Cadillacs, etc., that came out in 1986, it was a hugely groundbreaking album. And the reason being is that when you heard it on the radio, it didn't sound like anything else that was being played at that point. And that was because Pete was playing through an amp and was using an old Tele, in his case, a 1956, refin Tele, through a Deluxe Reverb. And, he was using acoustic guitars and, fiddle and pedal steel and country music at that point in 1986 had moved away from using Teles, was very much in the Strat mode, and many times the Strats had EMGs on them or hum canceling pickups or something like that. Then amps weren't being used. Jimmy Bowen was a great, record producer. He didn't like noise at all, and he made all the guitar players, and bass players, made them all quit using amps. So they all had to start using, different preamps that they would plug in direct. So probably one of the most famous and most used, preamps was made by a guy named Mo West, who was the son of Dottie West. And that's what Reggie Young and Brent Rowan and all the cats, Brent Mason, all of them had this preamp, and or they had like the Mesa Boogie Studio preamp or things like that, and they would just go direct. And a lot of times electronic drums were used, keyboards were used more than pianos. It was a different era. So you take those sounds and now put a record against it that has twangy Telecaster, playing. Playing twangy, doinky, stuff yeah, it sounded, it was completely different, and it was the same thing as what Buck Owens did in the '60s. That Nashville was trying to chase the pop sound with strings and 335s and using the neck pickup, and all of a sudden he had these really twangy sounding records, and Pete and Dwight kind of did the same thing, and yeah, they made a huge impact and had a huge following, pretty quick. So let's talk a little bit about his playing, which I kind of did a little bit there. But if you had to take one Pete Anderson kind of track off the Dwight records, it'd probably be Guitar's Cadillacs that has to be the tune that kind of most exemplifies his playing. So you have this great opening lick. It's starting on the 5 chord, starting on the E, and then it goes into A. So you have that, which is great. That's a great kickoff to a tune. Then you have what he plays on the verses, which are these doinky kind of low string bends that harken back to like Red Simpson albums and things from the 60s, truck driver tunes. And then in the chorus, he does, kind of like boogie line. Then you go like to the solo, which is kind of like a counter melody. Then you have the fiddle solo, which again, that was not common in country music. Then you have his second solo, which to me, this is the part where it really blew my mind the first time I heard it, because I was like, what is he doing here? And he was taking sixths, and he was bending them. So this is what it sounds like without bending, but kind of getting the point across. It's okay, so that's without bending. So here's bending. So you're bending both of those strings, the high E string and the G string. And I love that sound. And I use that a lot when playing fills. I go, just sounds nice. And then Pete played it up, up on the 5 chord on the E. Just great stuff. And all these descending licks where he would play, he would cover the whole fretboard. He wouldn't just play in one area of the neck. Then you have, later on, you have I Sang Dixie, where it's very much echoing the Merle Haggard records, but without becoming some, pastiche or something like that. I mean, it's just like, really, really great part, which, again, that echoes back to the Haggard records, but without being just, copying stuff note for note. You have the things like Little Sister. All these great, bends and licks and hooks. And I think what I like about Pete Anderson, and what you like about him too, is he's a hook player. He doesn't try to be, like Albert Lee and play a bunch of swinging single notes or something like that. He took his strength, which he grew up as a blues player, and also, liking R&B like Cornell Dupree, and, liking the blues guys like Albert King and Freddie King. And then he got into country and was listening to James Burton and Don Rich. And he took those things and he had that blues intensity, but still thinking about hooks and playing, country stuff that just really worked because of his intensity and his focus on playing things that were melodic and that were memorable. So, it made sense to me when I found out that he had gone to a musicians institute and he had studied, Howard Roberts stuff and gone to GIT, because you can tell he really knows a neck. Reading interviews, he talks about tetrachords and just the way he had to play with Dwight versus, what he's done with, other artists that he's, worked with. He's so smart with, the way, he makes records. He makes records that are retro sounding, but yet they're modern and using modern equipment. And, on those Dwight records, he would have a guy like Dean Parks, who's one of the greatest LA session guitar players of all time, playing acoustic. And I mean, he's one of the smoothest acoustic guitar players you'd ever want to have. He's the best. It's like that's him on, Clapton's Change the World, playing the chordal stuff that you hear. That's Clapton playing the solo, but all that stuff at the beginning of the song and all during the verses, the rhythm playing, that's all Dean Parks. So next to Dean Parks, he'll have J.D. Maness, who was a buckaroo and also played the Desert Rose Band and others. Or you'd have Tom Brumley. Tom Brumley was an original buckaroo and played that iconic part on Together Again. How smart is that? Using those guys, on those records. Another example of just how, wise, Pete Anderson, is and was, back on those records was Dwight had written this body of work in the early 80s that included songs like Guitar's Cadillacs and I Sang Dixie and others. And Dwight thought, this is my first album. Pete Anderson said, no, these are all gold. These are all singles. If you put them all on one album, only 2 or 3 of them will be released as singles and the rest of them will just die on the vine. They'll just be album cuts that people like, but they'll never be heard on the radio. Pete Anderson said, no, we're going to space them out. We're going to put 2 or 3 of these great songs that you've written on each album. And so throughout the 80s, they spaced out those songs, and those were, sure enough, those were the hits. They'd add some covers or some other tunes that Dwight had written that maybe weren't as strong. But those songs are what carried those albums. Another example of Pete Anderson's just wisdom and hard-working attitude was the way he would rehearse a band. And the only way I knew about this was because of a story that Red Volkart told me. And he told me that Pete would rehearse the band to death to where they could play the songs in their sleep. And the reason is that, on gigs you have all sorts of problems that come up, but if you know those tunes backwards and forwards, you can just keep going and playing, even if you can't hear yourself. And so Dwight did not want to do that type of, rehearsing. And so he just wanted to come in at the end. So Pete would hire Jim Lauderdale, the great songwriter and artist, to come in and be a stunt double, for Dwight in the rehearsals. And so they would rehearse for weeks with Jim Lauderdale, and then they'd bring in Dwight at the end and go out on tour. Come on. I mean, that's what it takes. Hard work, determination, just, going for it. I love that. So let's talk a bit about his gear. Of course, I've already kind of referenced that he was kind of an old school kind of player, in his gear choices, using a 56 Tele on that first record with, probably Deluxe. He also played a 59 Tele custom a lot, and it was the Sunburst with the white binding and rosewood fretboard. And it was the pickup cover on the neck was missing, And he soon switched to a 6-saddle ashtray bridge, kind of like Fender sold in the 70s, and was on like the humbuckered Telecustom or custom Tele. And then he eventually put a Goto heavy brass 6-saddle bridge on there, and that was kind of that guitar. And also used a 59 hardtail Strat, and that's probably most popular, most known for like playing on Fast As You. Amp wise, he really was a Deluxe Reverb guy early on, and he would use 1 or 2 of them, and then he started having to hop them up because the band was getting louder, and ended up with amps that had bigger transformers, 6L6s, Electro Voice speakers, the old coffee can EV speakers, not like the EVM 12L, but the earlier ones. And then he had, this is really cool, he had a wet-dry system. So he would go into a good rich volume pedal that was low impedance, that had a preamp in it. And then he would go into one of the amps, one of the Deluxes, and then he would go from that through an old Boss CE1 chorus and an Echoplex, and then into the other one. So he had a dry amp, so he had a wet-dry rig, back in the early 80s, early mid-80s. It's like, that's brilliant, and and he would turn that chorus on when he was kind of going for more of a steel guitarish, or maybe more of a Hispanic Tejano, kind of vibe, and he could, bring that up as much as he wanted it. And what a great tone, stellar tones. So, yeah, I love Pete's playing, and just gained so much, respect for him, the more I've learned about him, and the way he produced records, the way he plays, the way he, just has an intensity to his playing and thinks about hooks, and never tried to be Albert Lee. As much as I love Albert Lee, I'm glad that he didn't try to be Albert Lee. And yeah, so I'll, in the description to the video, there'll be a link to Spotify where I'm going to create a playlist, and there we can all kind of get schooled by Pete Anderson and hear his, stellar tone and playing, and how influential it is. So I hope you'll check that out and enjoy it. Well, thank you so much. I hope y'all have a great, great week, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.